Memoirs of the Reverend William C. Burns, Chapter 13, 1847, The Field and Its Pioneers. China proper is a compact territory. You would only need to cut off a few projections and fill up a few indentations in order to bring it into either a circle or a square, for its length and breadth are nearly equal. It includes more than 1,000,000 square miles, and lying between the 20th and 42nd parallels of northern latitude, it enjoys on the whole an excellent climate. Two noble rivers, the HWANG-HO and YANG-TSE-KIANG, the Yellow River and the Son of the Queen, flow down its center and fertilize the most populous regions in the world. The ocean, sprinkled with islands, washes its eastern and southern coast. The mountains of Tibet are its western barrier, and on the north, it is still guarded by a wall 1,300 miles in length, which it cost the united labors of the nation to erect 2,000 years ago. Over this wall, or over these mountains, you instantly land on bleak deserts or barren wastes, and it is no wonder that in contrast with the encircling solitudes, the Chinese should have called their teeming soil the flowery land. Wide as the surface is, the swarming inhabitants require it all. From the safest calculations, as the imperial census, the present population cannot be less than 360 million, or a third of the world's inhabitants. To stow away such a multitude needs the utmost economy of room, and in it expedient for sneezing existence into the smallest possible compass. The Chinese continent resembles the cabin of a ship. Crops are grown in places where you would think none, but the birds could have planted them, and in their anxiety to leave every inch available for culture, they contrive to put past themselves and their families in all inconceivable corners. They cannot double their area, but their genteel sky allows them to double their harvest by sowing 2 crops in the year, and as land is so precious, many of this evenly minded and compressible people are content to live on the water. Most of the rivers are strewed with these floating cottages, and in truth the crowded life of the Chinese people is due not so much to the narrowness of the land as to the variety of its surface. The sterile and inhospitable character of a large part of the empire compresses a population which on the average is not more dense than that of England into a comparatively limited space. To the west are vast mountain ranges with giant peaks, frowning gorges, and forests of cedar and of pine. In the center is a hilly region, gradually softening down into those gentle, breezy slopes on which the tea plantations flourish, while to the east and seaward there stretch out wide and fertile plains, studded with towns and villages, and cultivated every inch like one vast garden. It is this vast region that constitutes that teeming hive of human life with which we are familiar, and of which alone, till recently, we could be said to possess any authentic knowledge. The people are quiet, industrious, orderly, mechanically civil, and artificially refined, deeply sunk indeed, like all heathen nations, into ungodliness and sin, but addicted rather to the quieter than the ruder vices. They are intensely sensual, but not fierce or cruel, though the very apathetic and shallowness of their nature renders them on occasions regularly reckless on the shedding of blood. They love their children and have more than any other heathen people of the sentiment of home and family life, and yet the inconveniences of an overcrowded country induces them to expose by merits their female offering. female offsprings. Their religion is a strange melody of diverse creeds dwelling together in peace and blending more or less together in the ideas and life of the people. The first of these was founded by Confucius in the 6th century. It is the religion of the literary and of the present emperor, but there is no reason why it should be called a religion, except that its volunteers believe in nothing besides. It consists of a few moral and practical maxims and evades the existency of God and the immorality of the soul. The Confucians are the atheists and the philosophic Unitarians of China. Next comes the Taou sect, whose founder, Laou-Tsze, lived in the days of Confucius. Unlike the Confucians, who believe in nothing supernatural, the followers of Laou-Tsze have peopled earth and air with all sorts of spirits and demons. They deal in magic and are constantly consulting maniacs and others who they deemed possessed, and it used to be their great problem to discover the elixir of immortality. They are the fanatics of China. And then we have a sect not of Chinese but Indian origin, and far more popular than the other two, the Buddhists. The object of their ambition is to lose all personal identity and be absorbed into Buddha. Contemplation and abstraction of mind are their highest enjoyments, and to lose all contact with earthly things. To live without looking, speaking, hearing, or smelling is the nearest approach to perfection. They are the mystics of China. Such as it is, the religion of this strange and singular people obtrudes itself everywhere. The land teems with images. Their temples, houses, streets, roads, hills, rivers, carriages, and ships are full of idols. Every room, niche, corner, door, and window is plastered with charms, amulets, and emblems of idolatry. Add to these particulars one or two characteristic features more: their singular reverences for the tombs and for the memories of their ancestors, their ancestral tablets and ancestral religious rites, their one written and their many spoken languages, their universal system of education and literary examination and degrees, upon which, by a remarkable anticipation of our recent civil service reforms, the appointments to all public offices of trust and profit depends. Their strange and whimsical, but often rich and showy costume, the tails and silk robes of the men, and the cramped feet of the women. Their eager curiosity, especially in the inland districts, about the persons and the movements of strangers, making the hapless traveler, often 10 minutes after his arrival, the center of an excited crowd, which fills doors and windows and almost stops the traffic of the streets. Their fortune-tellers, their storytellers, their jugglers, and their rude but vastly popular stage plays, held in the open air, at the expense usually of some rich citizen, and open to all comers, their pleasant life in canals and rivers. In boats they serve often for weeks together, both for locomotion and lodging, and which, moored close to the gate of some populous town or city, make the stranger at once at home in the place of his sojourning. Their multitudinous and meaningless religious ceremonies, in which there is scarcely anything of religion or religious belief, and, in fine, their measurement of time, not by weeks, but by the periodical recurrencies of market days, ever more painfully reminding the missionary that he dwells in a Sabbathless land, and we shall be able to form a tolerably distant idea of the circumstances and scenes in the midst of which we have now to place ourselves, and with which, in the course of our narrative, we shall become more and more familiar. Towards this vast and interesting field, the missionary spirit of the Christian Church was at a very early period directed. So early as the 7th or 8th century, missionaries from the Nestorian churches in Persia found their way to China. And from the 14th century onward to the present time, the Romish Church has scarcely ever been without its missionary representatives, some of them men of devoted zeal and rare ability. Francis, Xavier, preeminent above them all, to whom, however he may estimate the character of their work or the quality of its results, belongs the undoubted honor of having been first in the field and of having held forth a bright example of enterprise and heroism, which the Reformed Church was but too slow to follow. At the time at which our narrative begins, there were in China 170 Roman Catholic missionaries and upwards of 200,000 converts. In the year 1806, Robert Morrison, the first Protestant missionary to China, was set apart to work in Swallow Street, Scott Church, London, under the auspices of the London Missionary Society, and arrived at Macao on September 4, 1807. There, in a warehouse which he rented, he plodded on in his secret labors at the language, hardly venturing out among the suspicious inhabitants, and hiding the lamp by which he studied behind a volume of Henry's Commentary. After 10 years of toil, he completed a heroic task and printed in 6 quartos a dictionary of Chinese, and after being joined by a like-minded laborer, Dr. Milan, had the happiness to translate into Chinese the entire word, which by the amazing ingenuity and industry of a brother missionary was printed in a new and beautiful style. He was a man indeed singularly fitted by the gifts alike of nature and of grace for the work which he had undertaken, and especially at the particular stage which that work had then reached, with talents rather of the solid than the showy kind, fitted more for continued labor than for sudden burst of genius, and with a shrewd caution which was of great price, in a station where one false step at the beginning might have delayed the work for years. For 18 long years he labored on unobtrusively and unweariedly, himself but little seen, but his eye ever fixed on the Master and the Master's business. He died in 1834, having been preceded 12 years by his beloved brother and true yokefellow, Dr. Milan. Though the time of fruit was not yet, they were honored to gather some precious first fruits of China unto Christ, conspicuous among whom were Leang and then Afah and Keuh and then Agang, who long survived them as constant disciples and zealous and successful preachers of the gospel. But their work was that of pioneers rather than of cultivators of the land, gathering little fruit themselves, but preparing the seed for many harvests yet to come. Their true monument is the Chinese Bible and the Chinese College. Footnote: the Anglo-Chinese College, founded at Malacca in 1818 for the cultivation of English and Chinese literature, and thereby promoting the propagation of Christianity in the Far East. Dr. Morrison himself made the munificent offering of £1,500 towards the carrying out of this object, in which we must recognize the true precursor of the educational missionary institutes originated by Dr. Duff in Hindustan 20 years later. End of footnote. In the enduring memory of that work of faith and labor of love and patience of hope, in the midst of all discouragements and difficulties, by which, though dead, they yet speak to all that follow after them, and which shall be remembered to their honor in that day, when they that sowed and they that reaped shall rejoice together. They will be ever recognized and honored as the true fathers of the Chinese Protestant missions and of the Chinese Protestant Church. With the opening of the 5 ports to foreign residents and foreign traffic in 1842, just 8 years after Morrison had closed his work on earth, a great impulse was naturally given to the cause of Chinese missions, and representatives of all the great societies in Britain and in America speedily hastened to the field. Within 4 years there were already in China, or on the way to it, 50 Protestant missionaries. The field, so long jealously guarded and hedged around, was suddenly thrown open and laid white unto the harvest, and the eager reapers were hastening from every side to cut it down. Such were the main incidences in the past history of the work on which the subject of this memoir now entered. with the ardent zeal of a Xavier, with the patent consistency of a Morrison, patient consistency of a Morrison, and with a consecration of heart and an abnegation of self equal to any of those who had ever trod that distant shore. End of chapter 13. Having been read by Peter John Parisi, also known as Brian Dean. None of my audios are copyrighted. Please feel free to make as many copies as you desire to the glory of God. Memoirs of the Reverend William C. Burns, Chapter 14, 1847 to 1855, Breaking Ground. 40 years had elapsed, said the Reverend James Hamilton in his report to the Synod early in the next year, since a young man, a native of Newcastle, and brought up in one of our Presbyterian churches, effected his circuitous and almost clandestine passage as the first Protestant missionary to the Chinese Empire. Arriving solitary on a shy and unwelcoming shore, with no Christian friend to cheer him and no European arm to shelter him, that faithful servant of Jesus spent years of lonely and perilous toil in conquering a language with which scarce an Englishman had dared to grapple. But many a happy change, the harbor of changes happier still, may thankfully be recognized in Mr. Burns' entrance on his work. Proceeding boldly to his destination, an honored passenger in one of Britain's gallant argosies, and needing no alien interposition to smuggle the evangelist into a land which Britain then forbade the evangelist to tread, landing in open day and beneath the glad assurance of the Union banner, he found the missionaries of two hemispheres, as well as Chinese Christians, there before him. And while he would join our dear friend in commemorating these bright distinctions of his lot, we record with special thankfulness the progress which he has already made as a Chinese scholar. The wonderful labors of Morrison and his coadjutors, notwithstanding, the language still remains, of all dialects, the mightiest barrier to intercourse, and with all the helps afforded by his predecessors in this arduous work, and with all the faculties for quiet and unmolested study in an English settlement, we fully recognize that years might pass before Mr. Burns could make any practical essay in that appalling tongue. Already, however, before faith and energy, its terrors seem to disappear, and although it is only a year since our brother began to apply his mind to the study, and though he had only been 2 months arrived when he last wrote, we record it with joy and wonder, he was already attempting to publish the Word of Life in the speech of Sinim, S-I-N-I-M. Having obtained access to the prisoners in the public jail, he was enabled to read the Scriptures to them, and even to address them briefly so that they understood. In this last incident, he thus refers in his journal of the date, January 4th, 1848. During the past month, I have been making some progress in the Chinese, and have had some opportunities of bringing into use the measure of knowledge already acquired. A fortnight ago, Dr. Morrison asked me to go and visit in the prison 3 Chinese criminals under sentence of death for murder, and who were in deep distress and anxious to be visited by the ministers of Christ. Unable to do much, I felt called to do what I could, and as the execution of the sentence was delayed longer than usual in consequence of the absence of the governor, I had almost daily opportunities of meeting these poor men. I generally went alone, but at other times in company with the Chinese preacher, Chin Sin. They were very anxious to hear the way of salvation through Jesus, and evidently strove to understand my broken Chinese. Although unable to say much to them, I made them read with me Christian books, and on several occasions I even joined with them in prayer through the medium of their own tongue. They did not speak the Canton dialect, which I am chiefly studying, and this no doubt made my rude attempts less intelligible. Yet I felt encouraged and enjoyed, I think, something of the power of the grace in praying with them and for them. One of these poor men has received a commutation of his sentence. The first beginning of his work in the sphere of direct missionary effort is characteristic and must have been peculiarly congenial to him. Like that divine master in whose steps he walked so closely, it was ever his delight most of all and first of all, to care for those for whom few else cared, to leave the 99 in the safe and quiet pastures and go to seek the utterly lost in the far wilderness. The publicans and sinners in the highways and hedges, the neglected crowds of railway laborers or factory workers, the soldiers in the rough barrack room, or amidst the terrible temptations of the great city streets, had ever in his native land and in Canada had a special attraction for him as those to whom, as most needing, he owed the deepest debt of compassion and help. He loved to walk like Christ on the shady side of the world, and to be as a brother born to the sorrowful, the outcast, the forsaken. And so it was that in China, by a singular coincidence, it happened that his first care was directed to that very class to whom, 300 years before, the apostolic Xavier had looked on the probable objects of his first missionary efforts, only that now in these happier times it was not needful to become a prisoner in order to become the teacher of prisoners. He was quite in the spirit too of the whole life, thus immediately to begin his work with such imperfect means of communications as were then at his disposal, instead of waiting until a more perfect knowledge of the language should have given him the advantage of clear and fluent utterancy. In haste to reach the souls of those he had come so far to seek, he was impatient of the last barrier that still separated him from them, and if he could not yet break down that partition wall, he might yet, at least, hold broken converse with them through those narrow chinks and openings which he had already made. He could speak only, indeed, with stammering words and broken sentences, but those stammering words and broken sentences might still convey some grains of the precious gold, reflect some glimmerings of the eternal saving light, and that infinite blessing he dared not even for a moment withhold. Besides, while seeking to teach these poor prisoners the way of life, he would be at the same time learning something from them. He would sharpen and polish his rude instrument in the very act of using it, exercise his stammering tongue, and correct his broken sentences, while by their means he sought to instruct and comfort others. It was on the same principle that, as he tells us in his first letter from Hong Kong, he from the first attended regularly the daily Chinese service conducted by natives at the mission house and gave lessons in English to the boy that waited on him along with another while they repaid him with their Chinese, while he endeavored to speak with them as best he could, sometimes succeeding in being understood and sometimes provoking a smile only. Dr. Hamilton, I believe, is perfectly right in attributing his remarkable success in mastering the difficulties and disarming the terrors of this singular tongue, mainly to the faith and energy with which he girded himself to the task. He had indeed naturally a more than ordinary faculty for the study of language, and that faculty had at an early period received the very best discipline and training. But the natural faculty was more than doubled by the intense and consecrated energy with which, when called for by the highest ends, he used it. Here, as in everything else, which concerned the service of his divine master, whatever his hand found to do, he did it with his might. As before in the case of the French in Canada, so here he might be said, for the time, to have almost wholly lived in the element of Chinese thought and Chinese speech. He spoke Chinese, wrote Chinese, read Chinese, heard Chinese, sang in Chinese, prayed in Chinese. Far into the night sometimes might his voice be heard, reciting aloud the words of life, or pouring out his heart before God, in the broken accents of the strange tongue which for Christ's sake he had determined with as little delay as possible to make his own. 6 years after this, as I heard recently from a relative, when on a visit to England, he surprised a company of friends by suddenly pronouncing the blessing before meat in Chinese, and then calmly repeating the same in English. It was only as extreme incident of that which was in reality the ruling principle of his whole missionary life. From the first and in everything, to the Chinese he became as a Chinese, that he might gain the Chinese. Lived in the world thought their thoughts, spoke their words. It was thus alone, as it seems to me, that he was enabled in after years, as the prompt and fearless pioneer of the missionary band, to make those rapid transitions from one sphere of labor to another, which required, in each case, the forgetting of one's language and the learning of another. The acquiring of a new Chinese dialect was comparatively an easy task to him, because he lived habitually in a Chinese element and was thoroughly imbued with the very spirit of all Chinese thought and speech. The following extracts from his letters will still further illustrate the nature of his work and the spirit which actuated him during the first, and necessarily in a great measure preparatory and tentative part of his missionary life. Hong Kong, December 27, 1847. My dear Mother, I am again allowed the opportunity of addressing you from this distant shore, that you may know something of what I am doing, and that I may find at last some vent for those feelings which the thought of those from whom I am so far removed awakens. I have been, since I last wrote, going on with my Chinese studies, and I desire to be thankful that I am enabled to make a little progress, while the difficulties that remain still to be encountered before I can attain to do anything like a full mastery of the language are so many that, were it not for the greatness of the end in view, I would be disposed to abandon the undertaking. Then, after referring to his visits to the prisoners, it is encouraging, he continues, even already to be able to point, even in a few expressions, to the Lamb of God, who taketh away the sins of the world, to the root of Jesse, to whom the Gentiles are to seek and find his rest to be glorious. Among our own countrymen, last Lord's Day was interesting as that on which, for the first time, a congregation met here in connection with the Presbyterian Church. The place of meeting at present is central and convenient, an old bungalow immediately behind the clubhouse, and though the numbers attending may not at first be very large, yet it is hoped that by the blessing of God this may form the beginning of that which shall issue in important results, both among the Chinese and among our own countrymen. To this congregation he continued to minister during the whole period of his stated residency in Hong Kong, without, however, undertaking the task of constituting a regular church or entangling himself in any way that might retard his labors among the Chinese. Meantime, while his spare time and spare thoughts were given to his countrymen, his main strength and his whole heart were still with those in whose behalf he had come, and with whom, in the whole circumstances of his life, he more and more identified himself. Leaving the comfortable lodging in a European family in which he had been at first received, he removed to a hired house of his own in the midst of the native population, where he might bury himself out of sight with Chinese companions and in a Chinese house. His mode of life there must have been a very humble one in the eyes even of his humbler neighbors, if one may judge from a significant incident which he afterwards playfully told me. There had been some commotion in the neighborhood in consequence of some petty robbery or other misdemeanors, and an excited crowd was passing before the door in eager pursuit of the culprit. "Oh, you need not look there," cried one from amongst the throng. "It is only a poor foreigner." On the 28th March, he again writes to his mother, "After having worship with my Chinese family, 2 servants, a teacher, and 3 boys, I take up my pen to endeavor to hold some kind of communication from this distant region of the earth with those who are dearest to me on it. I feel, as I did last time, the want of hearing from any of you, but I have been comforted in some degree by the absence of any bad news, whether by the papers or by Mrs. K's letters. May the living and true God be the God and Redeemer and portion of each of my beloved friends, and be more and more gracious to and more glorious in the eyes of my beloved parents as they advance to the borders of the unseen and eternal world. May you be enabled to say with the divine psalmist, who have I in heaven but thee, and there is none upon the earth whom I desire besides thee. My flesh and my heart faileth, but God is the strength of my heart, and my portion forever. As for me, I shall behold thy face, and righteousness I shall be satisfied when I awake with thy likeness. May your faith be as the shining light, shining more and more unto the perfect day. Oh, that I might hear in this far land of those of our dear kindred that as yet love not Jesus, having the eye divinely opened to behold his beauty and preciousness. For myself, I am here in the midst of the people of a strange language, and who know not the true God, nor Jesus Christ, whom he hath sent to be the light and life of men. And yet I cannot say that I am a solitary or forsaken. I feel indeed more at home here than I did when I was last among you in Scotland, when the weight of that call, which I believed I obeyed in coming here, was resting upon me and making me as a stranger among my own kindred. When I last wrote, I had newly taken up my abode here with my Chinese domestics, and had been encouraged by feeling able to read and pray with them, though feebly, in their own tongue. My teacher had not then joined me, and I was uncertain whether he would succeed in getting a school formed on the principle of the gospel. In this, however, I have been encouraged beyond my expectation. He got a few boys to come from a little distance of his own acquaintance, and as soon as he opened the school, others came from the neighborhood of their own accord, so that at the last fortnight he has had regularly from 12 to 15 scholars. Were we to make any effort, I believe we could get more, but in the first instance, I want to go on gradually until the character of the school becomes fixed on right principles, and until I see that it is really promises to accomplish more than that which I sought it for at the outset, viz., bringing me into such intercourse with the people as might enable me to acquire the language as they speak it, and might open the way for preaching the word among them when I am able to do this. 3 of the boys stay with us in the house, and all of them come regularly to worship in the morning, when we have a little meeting of 17 or 18 persons in all. The school is, of course, shut up on Sabbath, but the last 2 Sabbaths most of the boys have been with us most of the day learning a Christian book, and have also attended Chinese worship of their own accord at the chapel in the London Society, where a native at present officiates. Soon after the school was opened, it was interesting to me one morning about 6 o'clock, and before anyone was on foot but myself, to see a Chinese woman with a little boy of 11 or 12 knocking to be admitted to the school. I thought of that blessed time approaching when the mothers of China will bring their children to the feet of Jesus, that he may bless them. The Chinese are diligent in learning after their own manner. They begin with the morning light and continue to con over their insipid task, insipid as we would reckon it, until evening. They are all intelligent and interesting race, and when the gospel takes hold of them in elevating and saving power, they will be interesting in another manner. Amid such quiet, patient, but unobtrusive labors, the first 14 months of his residence in Hong Kong passed away. Longing for great things, yet not despising the day of small things, he was content meanwhile to occupy faithfully the narrow sphere assigned him, and to wait in patience until the great Master should open a wider door. The time, however, was now come for a further and bolder flight. His proficiency in the spoken language of the Canton province was now sufficient to enable him at least intelligibly to declare his message. The shores of the continental China, with its teeming towns and villages, lay before his eyes, and he longed to be in the midst of the vast harvest field. It was true that as yet the permissive liberty of intercourse with the native population was confined within the limits of the 5 open ports, nor had any Protestant missionary hitherto extended his labors much beyond the precincts. There would, he knew, be much difficulty and possibly some danger in the attempt, but there was no manifest impossibility, and an impossibility alone was, in his view, a sufficient hindrance to one who would go forward in a great work in the name of the Lord. He would at least knock at the door and see whether that divine almighty hand would open it. You desired, said he in one of his letters, that 3 doors might be opened to me: the door of entrance into the language, the door of access into the country, the door of admittancy for the Lord's truth into men's hearts. The first of these has been opened in an encouraging degree already, and now remains to seek by prayer and actual trial that the other two doors may be opened also. He announced accordingly the discontinuance both of his Sunday English services and of the Chinese school at Hong Kong, and steadfastly turned his face towards the region beyond. On January 29, 1849, he writes, "The routine of my work hitherto has been in learning the Chinese language with the important accompaniment of preaching from week to week among my own countrymen. Now, however, I am entering as far as can be foreseen on a new sphere and a mode of labor, being about to discontinue my temporal position both among the Chinese and English, and go forth among the people of these shores with the word of eternal life in my hands, and gradually also on my tongue. Yesterday, Sabbath the 28th, I imitated the discontinuance of my English preaching, and today I have given warning to my servants, etc., that the school, which is at present interrupted by the Chinese New Year, will not be again reopened. To this decision I have been clearly led, as we have yet no prospect of any minister from Scotland, nor of any other missionary who might take up the educational part of the work among the Chinese, and I had but one alternative before me, viz. That on either proceeding to form a church and locating myself among my countrymen and in my Chinese school, or that of leaving both and going forth into the field at large, in order at once to obtain in a proper manner the spoken language and to spread abroad the gospel of salvation among these unsaved millions. This latter course I have felt it my duty to adopt, although it is one accompanied with many difficulties and dangers of direct kinds. But the work must be done, and I am enabled joyfully to say, Lord, here am I, send me. The young man who has been teaching the school and myself will not, I think, return to me, but the other two assistants will go forth, I trust, with me, and perhaps others also. Certainly my past habits and experience fit me above most preachers for attempting this mode of missionary work, but whether or how far I might be succeeded in it is with the Lord, as whose command alone I go forth. I need not add that in these circumstances I shall have special need of special prayer to be made in my behalf, and in behalf of the people among whom I may be led from time to time. With love to all who love the Lord and seek His face, I am, dear Mother, your affectionate son, William C. Burns. The event fully justified the decision which he had taken, and the brave and resolute spirit in which he prepared himself for its accomplishment. The difficulties and dangers with which he laid his account were indeed not wanting, but in the midst of them all his way was opened and his course prospered to a degree which he had scarcely dared to hope. While there were frequent risks from the assailants of robbers and the jealousy, spirit, and policy of the local authorities, he met everywhere amongst the great body of the people with that friendly reception which they have been since found in other cases to accord to any stranger who frankly cast himself upon their kindness. He possessed in large measure that genteel human sympathy and that quiet self-possession and promptitude of fit reply which Mr. Fortune tells us forms the best passports to the good humor and friendly entertainment of a Chinese crowd. And a foreigner who trusts himself in places where foreigners are rare must expect to live very much in the midst of crowds. So he found his way with comparatively little trouble or interruption from village to village, and seldom failed, at least in a numerous and inquisitive, if not earnestly attentive audience. Even the personal privation and hardships which he had regarded as inevitable were much less serious than he had anticipated, so that he very soon sent back to Hong Kong a heavy cloak which he had brought away with him, with the significant message that he did not need to sleep on the hills. His chief danger throughout arose from the general repute, sadly believed in his case, of the untold wealth possessed by foreigners, and the consequent sensation produced among the robber class by the arrival of a European stranger. Anything, therefore, in the shape of gold, or that looks like gold, he found the greatest possible hindrance to his quiet and peaceful progress, and a light purse the necessary condition of a light heart. Years after this, I remember that when I gave him a small pocket Bible in place of a much valued one, which he had lost. He said with a significant smile that his only objection to it was the gilded clasp, which he feared would one day attract the greedy eyes of some Chinese robber and cause the theft of the book for the sake of the gold, an apprehension which soon afterwards, in point of fact, fulfilled. From the following extracts, it will be seen that such pearls of robbers were the only serious pearls he encountered in this difficulty, and as it seemed to many at the time, somewhat daring undertaking. At SHAP-PAT-HOEUNG, or 18 Villages, February 26, 1849. My dear Mother, I have had the privilege of again hearing from you, and this privilege has been even greater than usual from the fact which the date of this letter imitates, that I am now no more among our countrymen, but am dwelling among this heathen people, alone. Were it not for the presence of a covenant God and Savior. In following out the purpose imitated in my last, I left Hong Kong on Wednesday the 7th current for the opposite continent of China, and have been, since that time, going from place to place with my Chinese assistants and one servant, much as I used to do in Scotland in days that are past. In some places I have spent only one day, and others I have remained for a longer time, the population being large and the door open. As yet I have been furthered and prospered far beyond what I looked for, and although the difficulties are many, even of an awkward kind, yet I do not despond in looking to the future. One of our difficulties arises from the constant fear the people are in of robbers, who suppose, though in my case without cause, the foreigners have much money with them, and again in places where there are mandarins, a foreigner is likely to be dislodged at once. This was my experience at first setting out, for I had spent only one night at Kowloon, opposite to Hong Kong, where I was warned to remove, and so had to retreat for the time. The people also at present are in constant apprehension of war with England, and this makes them more suspicious of foreigners who come into their borders. But with all this, I have hitherto had great liberty of access to the population, and as far as I have been able to declare my message, I have found attentive, and in some cases earnestly attentive hearers. The valley I am now in is full of villages, as its name imitates. It is also the seat of a market held nearly every third day, to which the people of the surrounding country would resort, and this makes it an important center of operations. Yesterday, the Christian Sabbath, was the market day here. I was out among the people about 3 hours and had much support from God. What need have I of the presence of the Lord of the Sabbath in a land like this, that I may not lose my own soul in seeking to save the souls of others? I shall probably need to leave this place soon, as the master of the house I am now in does not promise us lodging even for another night. But the Lord will provide. They shall not be ashamed that wait for me. At his first starting from Hong Kong, he had characteristically left his assistants to direct the boat in any quarter on the long extended coast they thought best, having no other plan but that of making known the gospel by tracts and speech, leaving all the rest, as well as this the greatest, to the gracious care of God. And so he went on from day to day in his work of faith and patience, passing on from village to village with the divine message, which it was the joy of his life to declare, simply as the unseen hand of his master seemed to open and point the way, now lingering for a while in one spot, now pressing rapidly on, as the pillar of cloud appeared to halt or to move onwards before him. As soon as he reached a village, he commenced to read his Bible aloud, say under the shade of a tree. Soon the villagers began to appear, and he explained to them the nature and the object of the gospel. Usually someone would ask him at mealtime where he was to eat, and he as usually partook of what was set before him by some hospitable villager. As evening approached, someone would offer him a night's shelter, and thus he went on from week to week, preaching a word and lacking nothing. Meanwhile, it was his lot, almost wholly, to plow in hope and to sow in hope, intensely longing for the fruit of souls, yet willing either to gather it in with his own hands or to sow the seeds of a harvest to be reaped by others. The entries in his journal are at this period singularly brief and hurried, mere jottings, evidently hastily noted down overnight in the midst of outward discomforts and almost constant movement. But only on that account speak the more impressively of the abundancy and self-denying nature of his labors. We went to Kowloon, but they took me to a schoolhouse rented by the London Mission, and after one day's stay among a listless people, we were obliged to leave in consequence of the mandarins remonstrating with the landlord of the house. On Thursday, the London missionaries came over, and I went back with them to the Chinese Medical Hospital, Hong Kong. On Friday, we again landed directly opposite at TSEN-SHA-TEIN, had good openings of favor among the villagers, and lodged in a mat shed, I eating as I had the previous day and have done since with my Chinese companions, but not putting on in the meantime any part of the Chinese dress. On Saturday, we removed to TSEEN-WAN, Shallow Bay Village, a distance of perhaps 25 Chinese miles. The people very friendly, but generally speaking the HAK-KA, not the Putti or the Canton City dialect. Here we remain until Wednesday, yesterday, when we crossed the hills, a distance of 20 or 25 Chinese miles, probably 7 or 8 English miles. To this village, covered with villages, SHAP-PAT-HOEUNG. Today I have been out and have had more encouragement in the aspect of the people, and also in my ability to communicate with them the great truths. Number 1, that there is but one true God, his character, etc. Number 2, that all men are sinners, idolaters, etc. And number 3, that there is a Savior and only one, Jesus, the Son of the living God. SHUM-CHAN, March 5th, Monday. Came here on Friday, after being 6 days at SHAP-PAT-HOEUNG, and 3 days at Sinting. People friendly. Arrived on the market day. Great press to see the foreigner, but all friendly. On Saturday, messenger arrived from Hong Kong, robbed, by the way, of the money he was bringing. In my own room, not an everyday privilege in this land. Oh, for the Spirit of grace to improve it. Chinese Hospital, Hong Kong, March 29th. We stayed at SHUM-CHAN until Wednesday the 14th, visiting the surrounding villages. 14th, we moved westward to SHEUNG-POO-TAN, visiting villages to the west, KAK-Ting, Kong Ha, Wong Kong, etc. 8 days. In SHEUN-POO-TAN, people very friendly and attentive. KAK-Ting, not so. Thursday returned to Shem Klang, invited to go back into the country. Crossed the YUEN-Long, and thus on foot at PAI-TEUNG, besides Cap-SHUI-Man, and thence by boat to this place, way prosperous. Arrived here at 6 o'clock p.m., just as Dr. Hirschberg, a dear brother who gives us lodging here, are about to land from Kowloon, to which he goes every Monday. Here I have ordered a Chinese dress, and I trust that next week I may go again into the country. The 7 weeks I have already spent there have been full of encouragements. Brief as these itinerary notes are, they will give the reader a tolerably distant idea of the character of the missionary's life and work during his first and tentative effort to carry the gospel message into the interior of the Chinese territory. The lodging in the mat shed, and the frequent alarms of robbers, the arrival of the messenger from Hong Kong without the expected money supplies, the summary dismissal by the mandarin, and the friendly bearing of the people generally, the eager rush of the market town to see the foreigner, the valleys thick sown with villages, the journeys on foot over the hills, the significant and touching allusion to the rare privilege of a night in his own room, the brief breathing time of retirement and prayer, in the midst of the poor and suffering, in the Chinese hospital, all, naked as they are alike to detail in coloring, form together the elements of a picture of apostolic faith and zeal, and self-denying labor, which rises to the mind's eye, as vivid as it is impressive and rare. After about a week's repose, Mr. Burns was again at his work August 1st, and continued his evangelistic movements among the continental villages for about 6 weeks longer, pushing his way still further inland to the north and the west. At the close of that period, however, the hot and rainy season rendered further progress for the present impracticable, while at the same time the more suspicious and less friendly attitude of the people he advanced westward gradually more and more closed the door against him. He accordingly returned to Hong Kong and took up his abode in a manner somewhat more permanent, and under the friendly roof of his endeared friend, Dr. Hirschberg, first on Morrison's Hill, and then at his new hospital in Victoria. Here he remained, with only one brief interruption, for the next 8 months, perfecting his knowledge of the Chinese language and becoming, as he says, less and less at home with the pen and more with the Chinese pencil, doing the work of a Barnabas among the sick and suffering in the hospital besides him, and cooperating zealously with his esteemed host in all other works and labors of love. But the nature of his occupations during this quiet interval, as well as the views and aspirations which emanated him, will be best learned from his own words, which will appropriately close the journal of his first stage of his Chinese life. Chinese Hospital, Hong Kong, June 21st, 1849. My dear Mother, my last letter would not prepare you for hearing from me again so soon, and that too from this place. I went on last occasion more to the westward, having already visited a good part of those who speak my dialect to the north, and there we found the people everywhere so adverse to the presence of a foreigner that after sleeping 9 successive nights on the water and going from place to place, and not being allowed to lodge on shore, I returned here, where I have again resumed my quiet studies, and where I enjoy opportunities of doing what I can amongst the people, not only in speaking to the patients in the hospital, but in visiting others in the neighborhood. The season also at present, both from great rain and great heat, is not so favorable for that mode of life which I have been following for some previous months on the opposite continent. I trust that in due time my path may be further opened, and that it may graciously be made plain by the Lord in what way and in what place I am to be more permanently employed upon these shores. I do not think at present of returning to the continent, but it is possible that my path may be made plain to do so earlier than I can anticipate. Perhaps you are by this time aware that Mr. James Young, a much valued friend here, offered himself some time ago to the Presbyterian Church in England as a missionary. The last mail has brought to him the invitation of his offer or service being accepted. But where and how we may be located and employed on these shores is not yet fully determined, nor can Dr. Y. leave his present employment until the close of the present year. It was a great mercy that in my last journey, as well as in the 2 previous ones, I was preserved from every danger, although surrounded with perils seen and unseen. The night before I landed here, we were not, I suppose, above half a mile from a MACAO passenger boat when it was attacked by pirates and robbed, with the loss of some lives. The firing was so loud that in the dark we supposed it must be some English war steamer in pursuit of pirates. I was at this time on board the Chinese passenger boat from Canton, and no evil was allowed to come nigh to us. The person who has charge of the Chinese hospital where I am now lodged is a converted Jew, Dr. Hirschberg, connected with the Mother Mission Society. I have long enjoyed his friendship, and now for a season I am very favorably situated in lodging with him, both for learning the language and for speaking a little among the patients who come seeking cure for their bodily diseases. It is little indeed, however, that I can add regarding tokens of an encouraging nature among the people. But the day of mercy and deliverance promised will come, and then these ends of the earth shall remember and turn unto the Lord. You have need to pray for all of us who labor here, that we may be endured with a patient and persevering nature. For the natural and spiritual difficulties of the field are of no common kind. Commend me, dear Mother, to the prayers of God's people. May you and my Father never forget me when, either one or both, you draw near the glorious high throne of our Father in heaven. Jesus is the way. In his blood we have access. In him we are complete. Again, about a month later, July 25th, he writes, I take up my pen, not so much used in these days as my Chinese pencil, to write a few lines that you may know something of my present affairs. During the past months, I have been quietly resident here, and while I have thus enjoyed much leisure for study, I have also had daily opportunities of taking part both as a hearer and a speaker in the meetings which are held for the good of the patients and of the household. As I had no present need for my former native assistants who journeyed with me on the mainland, they left me more than a month ago, and I am thus in the meantime alone, in cooperating with others as formerly at home and in my own tongue. This kind of position suits me, and will probably continue to be my position here, until at least Dr. Young is ready to join me, which is not until the beginning of next year. It will remember me, dear Father, to all who ask of my welfare, and engage to pray much, and more, in our behalf, and that China's gates may be opened to the King of Glory. One more effort, November 1849, to resume his evangelistic labors on the mainland, in which he was met with obstacles still more formidable than on the last occasion, and returned, robbed and stripped of everything but the clothes necessary to cover him, and his work at Hong Kong and its vicinity closed. He sailed with Dr. Young, whose brief but bright career was for the next 4 years intimately associated with his, for Canton, on the last day of February 1850. End of chapter 14, having been read by Peter John Paresis, also known as Brian Dean. None of my audios are copyrighted. Please feel free to make as many copies as you desire to the glory of God. Memoirs of the Reverend William C. Burns, Chapter 15, 1850 to 51, Canton. We have already remarked that Mr. Burns' labors on Chinese soil had been hitherto mainly preparatory and tentative. The question of a permanent center of operations for the infant mission had not even yet been determined. The balance of opinion, however, in the Home Committee had been for some time back turning more and more decidedly towards Amoy. And in this judgment, Dr. Young very strongly concurred. Mr. Burns himself so far acquiesced in it as to have actually taken his passage for that port on September 5, 1849, when his course was arrested by an attack of fever, brought on, as he thought, by the anxieties of the decision and exposure to the sun during the numerous salutations of a hurried leave-taking. The decision, however, had clearly not been taken without some misgiving. On his recovery from illness, the suspended purpose was for the present silently dropped, and was never afterwards resumed, until he had fully proved by prayer and earnest effort whether another or still wider door nearer at hand were not open to him. It is probable from the first, and whilst wandering amongst the villages opposite Hong Kong, his eye had been turned towards Canton, the great center of life in southern China, towards which, at each successive movement westward, he approached nearer and nearer. Kowloon, the point at which he first landed, is distant from that city only about 90 miles, and the whole district lying between, and which he had been since traversing, might be regarded as in its immediate vicinity. and as the natural pathway of advance towards it. It was the great center, too, of that dialect which for the last 2 years he had been so laboriously studying, and which was the only form of the Chinese spoken language which as yet he knew. The prospect, at the outset, was not very encouraging, nor did it, on further trial, greatly brighten. The door of entrance even to a settled residence in the city was never fully opened to him. He succeeded indeed, at last, after many harassing disappointments, in securing the expiring lease of a lodging from a brother missionary about to return to Scotland. But this was only for a period of 8 months, and at its close his position would be unfixed and as uncertain as ever. In other respects, too, the aspect of the field was scarcely more promising. While he enjoyed abundant opportunities of sowing the precious seed, and was seldom without a goodly group of apparently attentive hearers, yet it seemed to him that his words did not tell upon them. There was attention more or less fixed, but no impression. They listened to the truth, and possibly carried away some glimpses of it, but it did not take hold and keep hold of them. Few of his casual hearers ever came back of their own accord to hear him again, or sought the preacher out to inquire further of his message and his doctrine. He was even tempted sometimes to doubt if the Chinese were in their present state even susceptible of those deep spiritual impressions which he had seen in former days and looked to see again. Whether a lengthened period of preparation and the long and patient sowing of many laborers might not be necessary, or anyone might hope to return rejoicing, bringing his sheaves with him. Yet he went on patiently and hopefully, and speaks of himself as happy here and in the midst of his self-denying and apparently unproductive work as he could be anywhere in the world. There is nothing in his life, as it seems to me, more admirable, and in the whole circumstances of the case more remarkable, than this patient and steadfast continuance and well-doing in the midst of the most forsaken, uninteresting labors, and amidst the dead calm of a more than heathen apathy, equally as when borne along by the exhilarating breath of sympathetic enthusiasm and almost uninterrupted success. The two works, says Mr. Moody Stewart, were singularly diverse in their character, and were such as have rarely if ever been before allotted to one man to accomplish. Those who knew William Burns only as the enthusiastic preacher from town to town throughout the land would have looked upon him as the last man in the church who, after 8 years of what seemed the highest religious excitement, with thousands crowding to hear him, would set himself to what was then reckoned the almost hopeless task of thoroughly mastering the Chinese language, would secure himself from his own countrymen, and live among a people so different, teaching their children that he might learn their language and then adopt their dress and their ways, till in strange places the authorities were sometimes slow to believe him when he claimed to be an Englishman. Such, mainly, had been his work for many months at Hong Kong, and such, too, at least not more exciting or spirit-stirring, was his life at Canton. Meanwhile, Dr. Young had gone on before him to Amoy, and wrote from month to month most hopefully of the prospects of the work there, and urged him earnestly to join him. He still hesitated. There was not much indeed in the way of positive encouragement to detain him at Canton, no great or effectual door visibly open to him, and loudly calling upon him to enter. But yet there was not, on the other hand, any clear and decisive indication that God had no work for him to do there. It even seemed to him sometimes, as the months passed on, as through a prospect of ultimate success were beginning to dawn upon him, and as he saw the stolid countenance of his hearers now and then lighting up with something like intelligence and earnest interest, his heart yearned over them with a wistful hopefulness, and he felt as if he could not leave them so long as the faintest hope of a day of power and blessing among them remained. "If you do not hear," said he, "so interesting accounts from Canton as those recently received from Amoy, you must ascribe it in part to the defects of your correspondence, but still more, it may be, to the difficulties of this very important station, a station so difficult and important that I believe no agent who is in any degree suited for it, and who has a heart to love and labor for its proud and suspicious people, should be encouraged to leave it. Last Thursday evening, when looking on an assembly of from 50 to 60 engaged listeners, while a native was addressing them before I did so, my heart said, how can I leave these dear and precious souls for whom there are so few to care? I can now tell them of the way of life with some measure of clearness and acceptancy. And so long as God gives me standing ground to gather and address them, I must go on to do so, leaving the issues in his own hands, with whom it is to bless and save. Help us to maintain the combat in this great heathen city until its gates are open to the King of glory. Brethren, pray for us that the word of the Lord may have free course and be glorified. But those distant imitations of the Master's will, for whom he had so long waited, came, as he thought, at last. The door he had sought and hoped to enter was finally closed. The standing ground, which alone he desiderated as a warrant to remain, was taken from him. Shortly after the expiry of the lease, he had received notice to remove from the premises he had hitherto occupied, and all efforts to obtain another suitable station had failed. This, taken in connection with the open door and brightening prospects at Amoy, seemed to him decisive of the path of duty. Difficulties in the ordinary sense of the word had little influence with him. Rather only did they rouse him to more determined resolution to go forward in the course of service set before him, in the strength of him before whom the mountains flow down, and whose word is not bound. But the slightest indication of his will, the faintest whisper of his voice, was to him imperative. Such an invitation had now, he believed, been distinctly given to him, and he prepared himself without delay to obey it. He sailed from Canton, footnote, though there seemed to be no open door for him. There were several missionaries at the time laboring there, as we believe there still are, end of the footnote. After a residency of 16 months in June 1851, and reached Amoy on the 5th day of the next month. End of chapter 15, having been read by Peter John Parisi, also known as Brian Dean. None of my audios are copyrighted. Please feel free to make as many copies as you desire to the glory of God.